Story number 1. The Terror Beneath the Ice. The story of the Franklin expedition has haunted sailors for generations. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, sailed into the Arctic in 1845, seeking the fabled Northwest Passage. They never returned. What followed was a mystery etched in ice and blood, a tale of starvation, madness, and death. I didn't expect to find myself tangled in its legacy. In the winter of 2009, I joined an Arctic research expedition searching for the final resting place of terror. It had been over a century and a half since the Franklin expedition vanished. But new technology and persistent historians had uncovered promising leads. I was part of a small team led by Dr. Callum Spencer, an archaeologist with a single-minded obsession to find the truth behind Franklin's doomed voyage. Our ship, the Arctic Resolve, was state-of-the-art, equipped with sonar and remote submersibles. But the Arctic is an unforgiving place, and as we sailed further north, the ice closed in around us. By early January, we were locked in, the ship groaning as the ice tightened its grip. We had provisions, fuel, and equipment to last months, but the isolation weighed on us. And then we found the wreck. It was Dr. Spencer who spotted it first. The grainy sonar image unmistakable, a large vessel resting on the seafloor, its outline eerily preserved in the frigid depths. We sent down a submersible, its camera capturing haunting images, shattered timbers, corroded iron, and the gaping maw of the ship's bow. "Terror," Spencer whispered, his breath fogging the glass of the monitor. "It's her." We were ecstatic. Months of planning, weeks trapped in the ice, and now we were on the verge of rewriting history. But as the submersible explored the wreck, a strange silence fell over the crew. The images on the screen were wrong, grotesque carvings etched into the hull, symbols that looked almost alive. "They're just stress fractures," one of the engineers muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. Spencer dismissed our unease. "This is what we came for," he said. "Prepare the dive suits." 3 of us went down, Spencer, myself, and Claire, a marine biologist who'd been eager to study the wreck's ecosystem. The water was freezing, our suits layered with insulation, but the chill seemed to seep into my bones nonetheless. As we descended, the wreck loomed larger, its broken mast jutting upward like a skeletal hand. We entered through a breach in the hull, the submersible's light casting eerie shadows on the interior. The ship was remarkably intact, the icy water preserving wooden beams and metal fittings. But there was something else, a smell, faint but unmistakable, of rot. "Impossible," Claire said, her voice crackling over the comms. "Nothing should decay down here." Spencer ignored her, his flashlight sweeping the dark corridors. We found remnants of the crew's final days, broken crates, scattered tools, and, chillingly, human bones. Many were gnawed, the marks unmistakable. "They were starving," Claire whispered. "They turned on each other." I wanted to leave, but Spencer pressed on, his excitement growing with every discovery. We reached the captain's cabin, its door hanging ajar. Inside was a desk, its surface covered in frost, and a journal, its pages warped but legible. Spencer opened it, his gloved hands trembling. The writing was erratic, the words scrawled in a hurried, desperate hand. "It follows us, in the dark. It waits." We thought it was hunger, madness, but it is neither. It is watching. We returned to the Resolve in silence, the journal tucked safely in Spencer's bag. The crew greeted us with excitement, but the mood on board was tense. That night, the wind howled around the ship, and the ice groaned like a living thing. I dreamed of the wreck, of corridors that twisted and stretched, and of something moving in the shadows. When I woke, my bunkmate, Derek, was gone. We found him near the bow, standing barefoot in the snow, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't respond when we called his name, his breath fogging in the frigid air. When we dragged him inside, his skin was ice cold, and his lips moved soundlessly. What was he doing out there? Claire asked. No one had an answer. Derek didn't recover. He sat in the infirmary, staring blankly, whispering to himself. Sometimes, I thought I caught a word. Hunger. Cold. Watching. The following days brought more strange events. Equipment malfunctioned. Temperatures dropped to unnatural lows. And a sense of unease spread through the crew. Then we lost power. The lights flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. Panic spread as we scrambled to restore the generators. But the darkness felt alive, pressing against us like a physical force. And then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voices were distinct, soft, overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They came from the walls, the floors, the very ice that surrounded us. Spencer was the first to snap. He locked himself in his cabin, refusing to come out. His voice hoarse as he shouted about the thing in the wreck. Claire found him the next morning, his eyes wide with terror, his journal clutched in his frozen hands. By the 7th day, there were only 3 of us left. The others had disappeared, their bunks empty, their boots left behind as if they'd walked barefoot into the ice. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and I felt the ship shifting beneath me, as if something massive was stirring below. Claire and I decided to leave. We packed what supplies we could and ventured onto the ice. The wind biting at our faces. The wreck loomed in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the gray sky. As we passed it, I felt a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing me toward it. We have to keep moving, Claire said, her voice tight with fear. But I couldn't. My feet carried me to the wreck, to the gaping hole in its hull. Inside, the darkness pulsed, alive and waiting, and then I saw it, a shape, tall and thin, his body covered in frost and ice, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It moved slowly, deliberately, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. The whispers crescendoed as it reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to civilization. When they found me, I was frostbitten and delirious, mumbling about shadows and whispers. No one believed me. Of course, they blamed the isolation, the cold, the madness of the Arctic. But I know what I saw, what the Franklin crew saw. The terror wasn't just a ship. It was a warning, and it's still out there, waiting beneath the ice. Story number 2. The Red Eyes of Point Pleasant. I never believed in the Mothman. Growing up in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, it was just a story. A local legend parents told to keep their kids from wandering into the woods. Don't stray too far, they'd say, or the Mothman will get you. We'd laugh, imagining a cartoonish creature with bug eyes and floppy wings, the kind of thing you'd see in a cheap horror movie. But the thing about legends is that they don't die. They wait. It started in November of 1966. When I was 17, the days were getting shorter, the air colder, and the streets of Point Pleasant had that eerie, small-town quiet I'd grown used to. Everyone was talking about Linda and Roger Scarberry, a young couple who claimed they'd seen something out by the old TNT area. They said it had wings. My friend Jimmy told me as we walked to school. Big ones, like a bird, but bigger. And red eyes. Chimed in Mary, his younger sister. Don't forget the eyes. I rolled my eyes. Probably an owl. But Mary shook her head. They said it wasn't an owl. It was standing on 2 legs, like a man. A few days later, Jimmy convinced me to go out there with him. Come on, he said, grinning. What if we see it? What if we don't? I shot back. Then we're just 2 idiots freezing our asses off in the woods. He laughed, but I could see the excitement in his eyes. Jimmy loved a good scare, and the Mothman was all anyone could talk about. Reluctantly, I agreed. We took his dad's old Chevy and drove out to the TNT area, a sprawling expanse of abandoned bunkers and overgrown fields. During World War II, it had been used to manufacture explosives. But now it was just a ghost town, a place kids went to drink or make out. The moon was full that night, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling buildings. The wind rustled through the trees, and every sound made me jump. Jimmy, of course, was having the time of his life, pretending to see red eyes behind every shadow. Maybe he's watching us, he teased, his voice a mock whisper. Maybe he's right behind you. Cut it out, I snapped, shoving him, and that's when we heard it. A low, guttural screech, like metal being torn apart. It echoed through the empty buildings, setting my teeth on edge. Jimmy's grin faded, and for the first time that night, I saw fear in his eyes. What the hell was that? I whispered. He didn't answer. We turned back toward the car, moving faster now. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the air felt heavier, colder. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and hunched, perched on the roof of one of the bunkers. Its wings were massive, folded against its back, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes glowed like embers in the dark. Jimmy, I choked out, grabbing his arm. Do you see it? He nodded, his face pale. Yeah. The thing tilted its head, like it was studying us. Then it spread its wings. A single, fluid motion that sent a rush of air toward us. They were enormous, easily spanning 10 feet, and the sound they made, like leather snapping, was burned into my brain. Run, Jimmy whispered. We bolted for the car, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it following us, the wind from its wings brushing against my neck. Jimmy fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath, and I slammed into the passenger seat as he started the engine. The headlights came on, and for a moment, I thought we were safe, but then it landed in front of us. It was even bigger up close, his body a strange, unnatural mix of man and bird. The red eyes glowed brighter now, and I swear they pierced straight through me. Jimmy hit the gas, and the car lurched forward. But the thing didn't move. Instead, it spread its wings again and took off, vanishing into the night. We didn't stop driving until we were back in town. After that, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring back at me. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, some freak mutation or oversized bird. But deep down, I knew better. The sightings didn't stop. More people came forward with stories of a winged creature, its glowing eyes and terrifying screeches. Some claimed it followed them home, tapping on their windows at night. Others said it was a warning, a harbinger of doom. They were right. On December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed during rush hour, plunging dozens of cars into the icy Ohio River. 46 people died, including Jimmy's older brother. The town was in shock, searching for answers, but none came. The official report blamed a structural flaw, but the whispers told a different story. People swore they'd seen the Mothman in the days leading up to the disaster, circling the bridge like a vulture. Some said they heard its screeches as the bridge gave way, a final warning no one had understood. I moved away from Point Pleasant after that. I couldn't stay, not with the memories of that night haunting me. But even now, decades later, I can't escape it. Sometimes, I wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, sure that I've heard the screech again. And sometimes, I see the red eyes in my dreams, watching me from the darkness. I don't know what the Mothman is, or why it came to Point Pleasant, but I know this, it's not gone. It never left. It's still watching, waiting, and when it appears again, something terrible will follow. Story number 3. The Watchers of Flannan Isle. I first heard about the Flannan Isles lighthouse as a boy. My grandfather, a sailor, used to tell me stories about the place. He called it the Eye of the Atlantic, a solitary outpost perched on the edge of the world. He said the island had a way of swallowing men whole. They didn't just vanish, he'd say, his voice low and gravelly. The island took them, I thought it was just an old sailor's tale until I found myself stationed there, more than a century after the mystery of 1900. And now I know he was right. In the spring of 2005, I was hired as a relief keeper for the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. The modernized beacon no longer required a permanent crew, but periodic maintenance was still necessary. I thought it would be an easy assignment, a week of solitude, tending to the light and enjoying the isolation. It sounded idyllic. I arrived on a gray, blustery morning, the ferry bobbing like a cork in the choppy sea. The island was as desolate as I'd imagined, a craggy expanse of rock and moss, battered by wind and waves. The lighthouse towered above it all, stark and imposing, its white walls streaked with salt. The ferry captain, a wiry old man with a weathered face, helped me unload my supplies. "You'll be fine, as long as you keep the light on," he said, his eyes lingering on the lighthouse. "Don't let it go dark." I laughed nervously, but he didn't smile. The first night passed without incident. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but the lighthouse stood firm. I kept the beacon turning, its powerful beam slicing through the darkness, and fell asleep to the rhythm of the waves. On the second night, I heard the whispers. They came just after midnight, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the sea playing tricks on me, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wind bit at my face, and the beam of the lighthouse swung overhead, illuminating the jagged cliffs. There was no one there, just the endless expanse of the Atlantic, churning under the moonlight. But the whispers didn't stop. The third day brought fog, thick and impenetrable. The world outside the lighthouse disappeared, swallowed by a wall of gray. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the silence was unnerving. Even the seagulls had vanished. I busied myself with maintenance, checking the machinery and cleaning the lenses. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers turned to banging. It started at the door, 3 sharp knocks that echoed through the tower. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed a wrench and crept downstairs. The fog pressed against the windows, a dense, swirling mass that seemed almost alive. When I opened the door, there was no one there. The banging came again, this time from the walls, then the ceiling. It moved around the lighthouse, a relentless pounding that seemed to come from inside the very stone. I shouted into the darkness, but my voice was swallowed by the noise. And then it stopped. The next morning, I found the footprints. They circled the lighthouse, pressed into the soft moss. They were large, impossibly so, and spaced far apart, as if made by something with an enormous stride. The tracks led to the edge of the cliff and disappeared. I thought about the keepers of 1900, Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur, the logbook they left behind, with its cryptic entries about storms and strange behavior, how they'd vanished without a trace, leaving only a toppled chair and an uneaten meal. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. On the 5th night, the light went out. I was in the kitchen when it happened, eating a cold supper by candlelight. The darkness was sudden and absolute, and for a moment, I thought I'd gone blind. Then I realized the beacon had stopped turning. I raced to the lantern room, my flashlight flickering as I climbed the spiral stairs. The machinery was still, the light dead. I checked the generator, the wiring, everything, but there was no explanation. It was as if the lighthouse itself had given up. And then I saw the shadow. It was standing at the edge of the room, tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer. It dissolved into the fog, leaving me alone with the broken light. I spent the rest of the night in the lantern room, clutching a wrench like it would protect me. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if they weren't meant for me. By dawn, The light had inexplicably started working again. I didn't question it. I packed my things and waited by the dock, praying for the ferry to arrive. When the captain finally appeared, I practically ran onto the boat. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked as we pulled away. I didn't answer. It's been years since I left Flannan Isle, but the memory still haunts me. The whispers, the shadow, the footprints, they were real. I don't know what took the keepers of 1900, but I'm certain the island is cursed. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of the lighthouse, of its cold, empty halls and the light spinning endlessly through the fog. And I hear the whispers again, calling me back. Story number 4. The Shadows of Dyatlov Pass. The Dyatlov Pass incident has haunted me for years. A puzzle with too many missing pieces. 9 experienced hikers, dead under circumstances so bizarre and chilling that even decades later, no one can agree on what happened. Theories range from avalanches to secret military experiments, but none of them explain the fear etched into their final moments. I never thought I'd find myself there, retracing their steps. But sometimes, the mountain calls you, and you don't know why until it's too late. In February 2012, I joined an expedition to the Dyatlov Pass. I wasn't a professional climber, but I'd spent years fascinated by the mystery. When a Russian guide named Alexei advertised a trip to the infamous site, I signed up without hesitation. There were 5 of us, me, Alexei, a documentary filmmaker named Elena, and 2 brothers from Moscow, Yuri and Dmitry. We were strangers bound by a morbid curiosity, eager to see the place where everything went wrong. We set out under clear skies, the air crisp and biting. The climb was uneventful at first, endless stretches of snow and ice, the peaks looming like silent sentinels. Alexei led the way, his voice cutting through the cold as he shared stories about the original expedition. They were young, like us, he said, strong, experienced. They knew the risks, but something out there, something they couldn't fight, took them. An avalanche, Yuri said dismissively. There's nothing mysterious about it. Alexei didn't respond, but his expression darkened. By the 3rd day, we reached the site where the Dyatlov group had pitched their final camp. The snow was deep, the wind biting, and the air carried an unsettling stillness. Alexei pointed to a spot where the ground seemed disturbed. The snow packed down in uneven patches. "This is where their tent was found," he said. "It had been slashed from the inside. They ran out, half-dressed, into the storm." "Why would they do that?" Elena asked, her camera trained on the site. "Fear," Alexei replied simply. "We set up our own camp nearby, pitching our tents against the wind. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and the silence became oppressive. The 5 of us huddled in one tent, talking in hushed voices. "What do you think happened to them?" Dmitry asked, his breath fogging in the cold. "Maybe it was the wind," Yuri said. "People panic in storms. They think they hear things. Or they did hear something," Elena said, her eyes flicking toward the shadows beyond the tent. "Something that didn't belong." That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum, barely audible over the wind. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The others were asleep, their faces pale in the dim light of the lantern. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold cutting through me like a knife. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant against the blackness. But the sound was everywhere, coming from the mountains, the snow, the very air. And then I saw them. Lights, faint and flickering, moving through the trees. They weren't flashlights or lanterns. They glowed with an unnatural green hue, swirling like liquid fire. For a moment, I thought they were the aurora, but they were too low, too deliberate. They moved as if searching for something or someone. I stumbled back into the tent, shaking Elena awake. "Come outside," I whispered. "You need to see this." By the time she joined me, the lights were gone. The next morning, we found tracks in the snow. They weren't ours. They were larger, deeper, and unlike anything I'd ever seen. They didn't look human, nor did they match any animal I could think of. The tracks circled our camp before disappearing into the forest. Alexei's face was pale as he studied them. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." "Leave?" Yuri scoffed. "We came all this way. Do you want to end up like them?" Alexei snapped, his voice trembling. "Whatever killed them is still here." Yuri and Dmitri argued, insisting we stay another night. But the rest of us were uneasy. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the mountain itself was warning us. That night, the storm came. The wind roared, slamming against our tents with a force that felt almost alive. The temperature plummeted, and the hum returned, louder and more insistent. I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that set my teeth on edge. And then the lights came back. They moved faster this time, darting through the trees like predators. The shadows they cast were wrong, too long, too jagged, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. I heard Elena scream, and then the tent collapsed as the wind tore through it. We ran. I don't remember much of what happened next, just fragments, the cold biting at my skin, the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, following us through the snow, the lights closing in, their glow searing my eyes. I remember seeing Dmitri fall, his face frozen in terror as something dragged him into the darkness. Yuri shouted his name, but there was no response, just the wind and the whispers. When I woke, the storm had passed. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the landscape. Elena was beside me, her face streaked with tears and frostbite. Alexei was gone. So were the brothers. We stumbled back to civilization, broken and half-frozen. When we told our story, no one believed us. They said the storm had disoriented us, that we'd imagined the lights, the tracks, the whispers. But I know what I saw. I've spent years trying to make sense of it, poring over reports of the Dyatlov Pass incident, looking for answers. But the truth is, there are no answers, just a mountain that doesn't let go of its secrets, a place where the rules of the world don't apply. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the hum, calling me back. Story number 5. The Curse of the Mary Celeste. The Mary Celeste was supposed to be my fresh start. After years of bad luck, broken promises, and darker days I'd rather not recount, the opportunity to join her crew felt like fate. She was a fine ship, sturdy and sleek, with a crew of 10 and a cargo of American alcohol bound for Genoa. Captain Benjamin Briggs was a fair man, quiet but firm, and the rest of the crew seemed capable enough. It was December 1872, and the open sea promised adventure, if not redemption. I didn't know then what we were sailing into. The first few days at sea were uneventful. The weather was mild, the ship steady, and the crew in good spirits. Captain Briggs kept to himself, as did his wife and young daughter, who joined us for the voyage. The sailors whispered that bringing family aboard was bad luck, but I dismissed their superstitions. We had a seasoned captain, a sound ship, and a clear destination. What could go wrong? It started with the fog. It rolled in one evening, thick and unnatural, swallowing the horizon in every direction. The sea turned still as glass, the usual creaks and groans of the ship muffled by the eerie silence. The men grew restless, their laughter and songs giving way to muttered prayers and furtive glances at the sky. "It's not natural," First Mate Richardson said, his voice low as we stood on deck. "Fog like this, it carries things." "Things?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He didn't answer, just stared out into the nothingness. By the third day, the fog still hadn't lifted. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and an unsettling quiet had settled over the ship. It wasn't just the crew. Even the ocean seemed subdued, its waves barely lapping at the hull. Then came the sounds. It started at night, a faint whispering that seemed to drift on the wind. First, I thought it was the men below deck. But the whispers were too soft, too strange. They didn't sound human. Do you hear it? Richardson asked me one evening as we stood watch. Hear what? I lied. He gave me a sharp look but didn't press further. I could see the fear in his eyes, though he wasn't the only one. The men were jumpy, snapping at each other over small things, their tempers fraying like old rope. The whispers grew louder with each passing night. On the 7th day, the cook vanished. It was Richardson who found the galley empty, the stove cold, and the soup pot untouched. No one had seen the cook since the night before. We searched the ship from bow to stern, but he was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no explanation. He wouldn't have jumped, one of the sailors muttered. He was too scared to even go near the rails. He didn't jump, Richardson said grimly. Something took him. The whispers that night were deafening. They seemed to come from everywhere. Above, below, inside the walls of the ship itself. I lay in my bunk, sweating despite the chill in the air, and listened to them calling my name. By the 10th day, the men were unraveling. Arguments broke out over nothing. Fists were thrown, and some of the crew started refusing to go below deck. They spoke of shadows moving where there shouldn't be shadows, of cold hands brushing against them in the dark. Captain Briggs tried to maintain order, but even he looked worn, his eyes sunken and haunted. His wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Sophia, stayed in their cabin, the child's cries sometimes piercing the unnatural silence. Then the cargo hold opened on its own. I was on deck when it happened, the hatch creaking loudly as it swung open, though there wasn't a breath of wind. Richardson and I exchanged a glance, and together we approached the gaping black maw of the hold. Don't go down there, one of the sailors hissed, his face pale as a sheet, but Richardson ignored him, grabbing a lantern and climbing down the ladder. I hesitated for a moment before following. The air in the hold was damp and foul, the shadows shifting unnaturally in the flickering light. The barrels of alcohol sat undisturbed. But there was something else down there, a smell sharp and metallic, like blood. We didn't find the source of the smell, but Richardson swore he heard breathing in the darkness. When we climbed back up, the sailor who'd warned us was gone. The next morning, Captain Briggs gathered what was left of the crew. 2 more men had vanished in the night, their bunks empty but undisturbed. The whispers were louder than ever, a cacophony that seemed to seep into our very bones. This ship is cursed, Richardson said bluntly. We need to abandon her. Briggs hesitated, his jaw tightening. And go where? We're miles from land. Anywhere but here, Richardson said. Whatever's on this ship, it's not letting us go. Briggs didn't argue. We lowered the lifeboats that afternoon, but before we could board them, the fog returned. It rolled in faster than before, a wall of white that swallowed the ship whole. The air grew freezing cold, and the whispers turned to screams. I don't remember much after that, just fragments, shadows crawling up the walls of the ship, the feeling of icy hands dragging me toward the rail, Briggs shouting orders, his voice drowned out by the howling wind. When I woke, I was in the lifeboat, alone. The fog had lifted, and the Mary Celeste was gone. They found me 2 days later, half dead from exposure. I told them what had happened, but no one believed me. They said the Mary Celeste had been found adrift, her cargo intact, but her crew missing. No signs of a struggle, no damage to the ship, just an empty vessel, eerily pristine. I've spent years trying to forget, but the whispers still come to me at night, soft and insistent, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the shadows moving in the fog. The Mary Celeste isn't just a mystery, she's a warning, and she's still out there, waiting.